I moved to that little town in eastern Kentucky the summer after my divorce, and I think a part of me knew from the first drive up the mountain that I was running toward something, not away from it. The road out of Lexington narrows the further east you go, and by the time I passed the county line, the trees pressed in close on either side of the asphalt, the kudzu swallowing old barns and billboards whole. The town itself was barely a town, a post office, a Dollar General, a gas station with one working pump, and a handful of houses strung along a two-lane road that wound up into the hollers. I'd found the house online for almost nothing. The photos showed a sagging front porch, peeling yellow paint, and a small fenced yard out back. In person it looked worse, but I didn't care. I had 2 suitcases, a pickup full of boxes, and an ex-wife 800 miles away who had made it very clear she never wanted to hear from me again. Quiet, I kept telling myself, was what I needed. Quiet would fix me. The day I moved in was one of those late July afternoons where the heat sits on your chest like a wet towel. I was pulling boxes out of the truck when I first saw Roy. He stepped out onto his own porch next door, a thin man in a gray work shirt, maybe in his 60s, with the kind of weathered face that could have been 50 or 70. He raised his hand in a slow, almost formal wave. I waved back, called out a hello, and he just nodded once and went back inside without a word. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Mountain folks have their own way, and polite distance isn't rudeness out here. It's a kind of manners I came to understand later, but not well enough and not soon enough. The first few nights in the house were exactly what I'd hoped for. The cicadas screamed from the trees so loud it felt like the whole mountain was humming. I slept with the window cracked open to let the cool air in, and I fell asleep easier than I had in months. I unpacked slowly. I learned which floorboards creaked and which ones didn't. I found the old hot water heater in the basement and figured out how to relight the pilot. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was building something small and solid that belonged only to me. And then, on the 6th night, I saw Roy for the second time. I was up for water around 2 in the morning, walking past the upstairs landing in my bare feet, when something outside the window caught my eye. I stopped and looked. Roy was standing at the edge of his yard, right at the property line where his grass met mine. He was facing my house, not his own, mine. His arms hung straight down at his sides, and he wasn't moving. At first I thought he was maybe just out there for some air, couldn't sleep, the way old men sometimes can't. I watched him for a minute, expecting him to shift his weight or pull out a cigarette or walk back inside. He didn't. I went to bed and told myself to forget about it. The next night I couldn't help myself. At 2 in the morning exactly, I went to the window and looked. He was there, same spot, same posture, same blank, forward stare aimed at the second story of my house where my bedroom sat. I closed the blinds that night with hands that weren't quite steady. By the end of the second week, I was checking every night, and every night Roy was out there, always at 2, always standing with his arms at his sides, no movement, no sound. What started to bother me more than his presence was the way he seemed to know exactly where I was sleeping. I had closed the blinds on the bedroom window, but on the 3rd week he shifted his position maybe 10 feet further south, to a spot in his yard where he had a clear line of sight into the bathroom window and the narrow gap beside the blinds where a sliver of light still leaked through. It was deliberate. He wasn't watching the house. He was watching me. I finally worked up the nerve to ask about him. The woman across the road was a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Hensley, and she had the kind of porch swing where you could tell she sat and watched the world go by for hours every day. I walked over one afternoon with a store-bought peach pie as an excuse and asked, as casually as I could, about my neighbors. She was friendly about the others, the young couple, 3 houses down, the old man with the chickens, but when I got to Roy, her face changed. She set her glass of tea down on the little wicker table between us and looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. She asked if he had said anything to me. I told her no, just the one wave. She nodded slowly and said that was good, and I should keep it that way. I pressed her gently. She sighed, looked out at the road, and finally said that Roy's wife had disappeared in 1998. Her name was Eileen. They'd been married almost 30 years. One morning she was just gone, no note, no car missing, no sign of struggle. The sheriff had searched the woods behind their house for 2 weeks. They never found a thing. Mrs. Hensley said Roy had been questioned, of course, but there was never any evidence. She told me, very quietly, that I shouldn't go over there, not for any reason, not even to be polite, not even to return a piece of mail that ended up in my box by mistake. Just leave it alone. Leave him alone. I did. For another week, I did. I kept the blinds closed. I kept the porch light on. I stopped going to the upstairs window at 2 in the morning because I didn't want to see him anymore. But I could feel him out there. I could feel that whole house, next to mine, its dark windows, its unmown grass humming with something wrong. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to the bed. I'm not a man who owns guns, and I told myself I was being paranoid, that a 60-something-year-old widower wasn't going to hurt anyone, that he was just a lonely man with a habit of standing outside at night. I told myself all kinds of things. Then came the night of the tapping. I had finally started sleeping through again. The bat had gone under the bed instead of next to it. It was the middle of August, and a slow thunderstorm was rolling up the holler, the kind that takes an hour to arrive and another hour to leave. I remember the sheet lightning flickering through the blinds, and I remember falling asleep to the low rumble of thunder somewhere off past the ridge. What woke me, I couldn't tell you exactly. Some small wrongness in the air, some change in the pressure of the room. I lay very still with my eyes open in the dark, and that's when I heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping. Not random, not the house settling. A pattern, 3 slow taps, a pause, 3 more. It was coming from the glass of the window directly above my headboard. My bedroom is on the 2nd floor. There is no tree on that side of the house. There is no trellis, no drain pipe, no ladder, no porch roof. There is nothing that a man could climb to reach that window. I know this because I had checked many times in the weeks before, whenever I couldn't sleep. I knew every inch of the exterior of that house. The tapping went on for what felt like a full minute. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I thought, if I turn over, if I look, something will be there, and I won't be able to unsee it. I will have to live in this house, knowing what it was. And yet I also knew, with a certainty I can't explain, that if I didn't look, the tapping would continue every night until I did. So I turned over, slowly, and I sat up, and I reached for the corner of the blind with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else. The tapping stopped the moment my fingers touched the blind. I didn't lift it. I couldn't. I sat there in the dark for I don't know how long, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears, and I waited to hear anything, a shuffle, a laugh, a breath, nothing. The storm rolled through. The rain came. I lay back down eventually, and I stared at the ceiling until the gray light of morning finally came through the slats. I made myself go downstairs at first light. The air outside was cool after the storm, and the grass was silver with wet. I walked around the side of the house, and then around to the front, and that was where I stopped. There were boot prints on my front porch, deep ones, pressed into the wet boards, with mud and pine needles clinging to them. They came up from the yard, up the 3 steps of my porch, and they stopped at my front door. They didn't turn around. They didn't lead back down the steps. There were no prints going away. I stood there for a long time looking at those prints. The rain had been heavy. Any prints would have washed out of the grass. But on the dry porch under the overhang, they were as clear as a photograph. Whoever had walked up to my door had not walked away. And yet the door was locked, as I had left it, and the house was empty, as I knew it was. I looked over at Roy's house. His porch light was off. His front door was closed. His truck sat in the drive where it always sat. But one of his upstairs windows, the one that faced mine, had the curtain pulled back just a few inches, and through that gap I could see a thin slice of his face. He was watching me, not smiling, not frowning, just watching, the way he watched my window at 2 in the morning, with no expression at all. I went inside and I packed what I could fit in 2 duffel bags, and I drove out of that holler by noon. I left a month's worth of things in that house. I paid the landlord through the end of the lease and told him to keep anything he wanted and throw the rest away. I never went back. I live in a little apartment in Louisville now, on the 3rd floor, and the windows face a parking lot lit up all night by sodium lights. I sleep with the curtains open. I tell people it's because I like the light. That isn't the real reason. The real reason is that sometimes, still, On nights when the air feels heavy and the rain is coming, I wake up around 2 in the morning with the sense that someone is standing at the edge of somewhere, arms at their sides, looking up at a window where I used to sleep. And I think about those boot prints on the porch that came up and never went back down. And I wonder, in the worst hours of the night, whether what walked up to my door that night really left at all, or whether it only learned how to wait. I never found out what happened to Eileen. I never asked anyone else in that town about Roy. I hope, if she is out there somewhere in those woods, that she is resting. And I hope, wherever Roy is now, that he is standing in someone else's yard and not mine. We moved onto that gravel road in East Tennessee the summer my oldest daughter turned 6, and for a long time I thought we'd found the closest thing to paradise a working family could afford. The road ran about a quarter mile off the county highway, cut up the side of a low ridge, and dead-ended at an old tobacco barn that had long since gone silver with weather. There were 9 houses on the road, counting ours, strung out with plenty of distance between them, and most of them had the kind of porches where the paint was peeling but the rocking chairs were well used. Our house sat about in the middle of the row. We had a half-acre of grass, a walnut tree my wife loved, and a view down the gravel road where we could see the last 3 houses if the leaves were off the trees. Our daughters Emma, 6, and Callie, 3, had more room to run than they'd ever had in their lives, and by the end of that first summer the whole family was tanner and happier, and sleeping better than we had been in years. The house at the very end of the road was the one I'm going to tell you about, though I didn't pay much attention to it at first. It was a small white house with green shutters, set a little further back from the road than the others, with a yard that nobody seemed to mow regularly but was never quite overgrown either. There was a pickup in the drive the day we moved in, an old blue Ford from the 80s. I never saw anyone get into it. I never saw it move. In all the months we lived on that road, that truck sat in the same spot in the same drive, and the same film of pollen and leaves gathered on its windshield every season. I first saw the boy about 3 weeks after we moved in. I was out in the yard after supper, coiling up a hose, and I glanced down the road and saw him standing at the edge of the last yard. He looked like he was about 10 years old. He was thin in a way that children aren't supposed to be, the kind of thin where you can see the shape of the bones in his shoulders through his shirt. He wore a gray t-shirt and a pair of faded blue shorts, and he was barefoot. He was standing with his arms at his sides, perfectly still, looking up the road toward the rest of the houses. The sun had just gone behind the ridge, and the light was that particular blue that settles into a hollow right before full dark. I watched him for maybe a minute. He didn't move. Then I went back inside, and I didn't think about him again that night. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing a pattern. The boy only came out at dusk. Never during the day, not once. Never in the morning, not even on the weekends when I'd be outside early with my coffee. Only in that 20 or 30-minute stretch between sundown and full dark, when the shadows in the holler are long and the birds go quiet and the first crickets start up. He always wore the same gray t-shirt, always barefoot, always stood in the same spot at the edge of the yard. He never played, he never ran, he never threw a ball or called out to anyone. He just stood there and watched the road. Emma noticed him before I thought she had. One evening in August, she came into the kitchen while I was making supper and asked me, in a small voice, why the boy down the road never came to play. I asked her which boy, pretending I didn't know. She told me about him, described him exactly as I'd seen him, and said sometimes when she was on the swing in our yard she'd wave at him, and he'd never wave back. She asked if he was sick. I told her honestly that I didn't know, and I told her that some families in the mountains were private, and that we needed to respect that, and to leave him be. She accepted it the way 6-year-olds accept things, and she didn't ask again. But I started watching him more carefully after that. I didn't like that my daughter knew he existed. I asked my closest neighbor, a woman named Darlene, who lived 3 houses down from us and had lived on that road for 27 years, about the family in the last house. Darlene was a talker. She'd tell you everyone's business on that road without much prompting. But when I asked about the end house, she got a strange look on her face, something between confusion and discomfort, and she said she didn't really know them. She said they kept to themselves. When I asked how long they'd lived there, she said she wasn't sure. When I asked if she'd ever seen the boy, she changed the subject and started telling me about her grandson's baseball team. I let it drop. But I remember walking home that afternoon thinking that in 27 years on a gravel road with 9 houses, Darlene had to know everybody. And the fact that she didn't want to talk about that house meant something I couldn't quite put words to. The evening the boy spoke to me was in late September. The leaves had started to turn, and the dusk came earlier. I was walking our old beagle, Murphy, down the road for his nightly constitutional, and I let him sniff along the shoulder while I enjoyed the cooler air. I hadn't noticed that I'd walked farther than usual until I looked up and realized I was only about 20 feet from the last yard. And there he was, the boy, in his gray t-shirt and bare feet, standing at the edge of the grass, watching me. He had never been that close before. I could see his face clearly in the last of the light. His skin was pale the way a cave fish is pale. His eyes were dark, set deep in his head, and they didn't track Murphy at all. They tracked me. I nodded at him, the way you'd nod at any child on any road, and I tugged Murphy's leash to turn us around. That's when the boy spoke. His voice was soft and flat, a little too low for a child, and he said, "You shouldn't let your little girl sleep by the window." I stopped walking. Murphy stopped too, I remember, and sat down in the road. I turned back to the boy. I asked him what he meant. I asked him which little girl. I asked him what his name was. He just stood there looking at me for a long moment, and then he smiled. I've tried many times over the years to describe that smile to my wife, and I have never been able to do it justice. It was not the smile of a child. It was the smile of something much older that was pretending to be a child, and had seen a smile once and was trying to copy it from memory. His mouth moved, but none of the rest of his face did. His eyes stayed flat and dark, and then he turned, slowly, and walked back across the yard toward that little white house. He didn't go in. He stepped up onto the porch and turned to face the road again, and he stood there in the dark watching me, and I walked home faster than I'd ever walked in my life. I didn't tell my wife right away. I felt stupid, a grown man, rattled by a strange child. I went upstairs when I got home, and I looked in on the girls. Emma was asleep on her side, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Her bed was against the outside wall of the house, directly beneath the window that looked out toward the end of the road, toward the last house. I stood in her doorway for a long time that night. Then I went in very quietly and I slid her bed across the floor to the opposite wall, beneath the window that looked out over our own backyard instead. She mumbled in her sleep but didn't wake up. I tucked her blanket back around her and I went to bed, and I told myself that I was being a paranoid father, and that in the morning I'd push the bed back and everything would be fine. I woke up at 3:12 in the morning to the sound of glass cracking. It was a sharp, specific sound, and I knew immediately which window it had come from. I was out of bed before I was fully awake. I ran down the hall to Emma's room, and I found her sitting up in bed with her eyes wide and her little hands covering her mouth. The window above the bed where she had been sleeping, the window I had moved her away from only a few hours before, had a crack running through it from top to bottom. Not a bullet hole, not a break. A long single crack, as if something heavy had struck the glass hard from the outside. Emma was staring at it. She wasn't crying. She was just looking at it with the kind of stillness that scared me more than tears would have. I grabbed a flashlight and my old deer rifle from the closet, and I went outside. The night air was cold, and the grass was wet with dew. I shone the light up at the window from the yard. The crack was there, unmistakable, running through the pane. I swept the beam across the grass. There was nothing in the yard. No one. No ladder. No broken branch. No rock. But on the wet grass, starting just beneath Emma's window and leading in a straight, unhurried line back toward the road, there were footprints. Bare feet, small ones, a child's size. They crossed our yard, crossed the shoulder of the gravel road, and continued up the grass of the last yard, straight to the porch of the little white house with the green shutters. They stopped at the porch steps. I stood in my own yard with the rifle in my hand and the flashlight in the other, and I stared at that house. The porch light was off. The windows were dark. The old blue Ford was in the drive, as it always was, with its windshield dusted in pollen. There was no movement anywhere. I went back inside. I brought Emma into our bedroom, and she slept between me and my wife until morning, and neither of us got another minute of sleep. At first light, I walked down to the last house. I was angry by then, and scared, and I had a lot of things I wanted to say. I pounded on the front door. There was no answer. I pounded again. Still nothing. I walked around to the side of the house and I looked through a window, cupping my hand against the glass. The house was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. No furniture, no curtains. A thin film of dust on the hardwood floor. A light fixture hanging from the ceiling with the bulb missing. A for sale sign lying face down in the corner of the living room, as if someone had taken it down from the yard and tossed it inside. I went back to the front door, and that's when I noticed the realtor's lockbox hanging from the knob. A little gray metal box with a keypad on it, the kind agents use for showings. I looked at it for a long time. I walked back up the road to Darlene's house and I knocked on her door. When she came out in her robe, I asked her, as directly as I could, how long that last house had been empty. She looked at me for a long moment and she said, quietly, "Honey, nobody's lived in that house in over 2 years." She told me the last family, an older couple, had moved out in 2019 after their daughter died in a car accident up on the parkway. She told me the house had been for sale ever since. She told me she'd never seen a child at that house in all the years she'd lived on the road. I moved my family out of that house by the end of October. I told my wife it was the schools. I told her it was the commute. I told her a lot of things. Emma's window was replaced before we moved. The crack was never explained. Nothing ever came into our yard again, as far as I know. But I still think about that boy sometimes, standing in the dusk in his gray t-shirt, in a yard in front of a house nobody lived in, watching a road that must have looked to him like a procession of strangers moving through his home. I think about what he told me. I think about the fact that he was right about the window. And in the worst hours of the night, I lie awake and I wonder what he would have done if I hadn't moved her bed. We moved onto that gravel road in East Tennessee this summer. My oldest daughter turned 6, and for a long time I thought we'd found the closest thing to paradise a working family could afford. The road ran about a quarter-mile off the county highway, cut up the side of a low ridge, and dead-ended at an old tobacco barn that had long since gone silver with weather. There were 9 houses on the road, counting ours, strung out with plenty of distance between them, and most of them had the kind of porches where the paint was peeling but the rocking chairs were well used. Our house sat about in the middle of the row. We had a half-acre of grass, a walnut tree my wife loved, and a view down the gravel road where we could see the last 3 houses if the leaves were off the trees. Our daughters Emma, 6, and Callie, 3, had more room to run than they'd ever had in their lives. And by the end of that first summer, the whole family was tanner and happier, and sleeping better than we had been in years. The house at the very end of the road was the one I'm going to tell you about, though I didn't pay much attention to it at first. It was a small white house with green shutters, set a little further back from the road than the others, with a yard that nobody seemed to mow regularly, but was never quite overgrown either. There was a pickup in the drive the day we moved in, an old blue Ford from the 80s. I never saw anyone get into it. I never saw it move. In all the months we lived on that road, that truck sat in the same spot, in the same drive, and the same film of pollen and leaves gathered on its windshield every season. I first saw the boy about 3 weeks after we moved in. I was out in the yard after supper, coiling up a hose, and I glanced down the road and saw him standing at the edge of the last yard. He looked like he was about 10 years old. He was thin, in a way that children aren't supposed to be. The kind of thin where you can see the shape of the bones in his shoulders through his shirt. He wore a gray t-shirt and a pair of faded blue shorts, and he was barefoot. He was standing with his arms at his sides, perfectly still, looking up the road toward the rest of the houses. The sun had just gone behind the ridge, and the light was that particular blue that settles into a holler right before full dark. I watched him for maybe a minute. He didn't move. Then I went back inside, and I didn't think about him again that night. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing a pattern. The boy only came out at dusk. Never during the day, not once. Never in the morning, not even on the weekends when I'd be outside early with my coffee. Only in that 20 or 30-minute stretch between sundown and full dark, when the shadows in the holler are long and the birds go quiet and the first crickets start up. He always wore the same gray t-shirt, always barefoot, always stood in the same spot at the edge of the yard. He never played, he never ran, he never threw a ball or called out to anyone. He just stood there and watched the road. Emma noticed him before I thought she had. One evening in August, she came into the kitchen while I was making supper and asked me, in a small voice, why the boy down the road never came to play. I asked her which boy, pretending I didn't know. She told me about him, described him exactly as I'd seen him, and said sometimes when she was on the swing in our yard, she'd wave at him and he'd never wave back. She asked if he was sick. I told her honestly that I didn't know, and I told her that some families in the mountains were private and that we needed to respect that and to leave him be. She accepted it the way 6-year-olds accept things, and she didn't ask again. But I started watching him more carefully after that. I didn't like that my daughter knew he existed. I asked my closest neighbor, a woman named Darlene who lived 3 houses down from us and had lived on that road for 27 years, about the family in the last house. Darlene was a talker. She'd tell you everyone's business on that road, without much prompting. But when I asked about the end house, she got a strange look on her face, something between confusion and discomfort. And she said she didn't really know them. She said they kept to themselves. When I asked how long they'd lived there, she said she wasn't sure. When I asked if she'd ever seen the boy, she changed the subject and started telling me about her grandson's baseball team. I let it drop. But I remember walking home that afternoon, thinking that in 27 years on a gravel road with 9 houses, Darlene had to know everybody. And the fact that she didn't want to talk about that house meant something I couldn't quite put words to. The evening the boy spoke to me was in late September. The leaves had started to turn, and the dusk came earlier. I was walking our old beagle, Murphy, down the road for his nightly constitutional, and I let him sniff along the shoulder while I enjoyed the cooler air. I hadn't noticed that I'd walked farther than usual, until I looked up and realized I was only about 20 feet from the last yard. And there he was, the boy, in his gray t-shirt and bare feet, standing at the edge of the grass, watching me. He had never been that close before. I could see his face clearly in the last of the light. His skin was pale the way a cavefish is pale. His eyes were dark, set deep in his head, and they didn't track Murphy at all. They tracked me. I nodded at him, the way you'd nod at any child on any road, and I tugged Murphy's leash to turn us around. That's when the boy spoke. His voice was soft and flat, a little too low for a child, and he said, "You shouldn't let your little girl sleep by the window." I stopped walking. Murphy stopped too, I remember, and sat down in the road. I turned back to the boy. I asked him what he meant. I asked him which little girl. I asked him what his name was. He just stood there looking at me for a long moment, and then he smiled. I've tried many times over the years to describe that smile to my wife, and I have never been able to do it justice. It was not the smile of a child. It was the smile of something much older that was pretending to be a child and had seen a smile once and was trying to copy it from memory. His mouth moved, but none of the rest of his face did. His eyes stayed flat and dark. And then he turned, slowly, and walked back across the yard toward that little white house. He didn't go in. He stepped up onto the porch and turned to face the road again. And he stood there in the dark watching me, and I walked home faster than I'd ever walked in my life. I didn't tell my wife right away. I felt stupid, a grown man, rattled by a strange child. I went upstairs when I got home, and I looked in on the girls. Emma was asleep on her side, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Her bed was against the outside wall of the house, directly beneath the window that looked out toward the end of the road, toward the last house. I stood in her doorway for a long time that night. Then I went in very quietly, and I slid her bed across the floor to the opposite wall, beneath the window that looked out over our own backyard instead. She mumbled in her sleep but didn't wake up. I tucked her blanket back around her and I went to bed, and I told myself that I was being a paranoid father, and that in the morning I'd push the bed back and everything would be fine. I woke up at 3:12 in the morning to the sound of glass cracking. It was a sharp, specific sound, and I knew immediately which window it had come from. I was out of bed before I was fully awake. I ran down the hall to Emma's room, and I found her sitting up in bed with her eyes wide and her little hands covering her mouth. The window above the bed where she had been sleeping, the window I had moved her away from only a few hours before, had a crack running through it from top to bottom. Not a bullet hole, not a break. A long, single crack, as if something heavy had struck the glass hard from the outside. Emma was staring at it. She wasn't crying. She was just looking at it with the kind of stillness that scared me more than tears would have. I grabbed a flashlight and my old deer rifle from the closet, and I went outside. The night air was cold, and the grass was wet with dew. I shone the light up at the window from the yard. The crack was there, unmistakable. Running through the pane, I swept the beam across the grass. There was nothing in the yard. No one, no ladder, no broken branch, no rock. But on the wet grass, starting just beneath Emma's window and leading in a straight, unhurried line back toward the road, there were footprints. Bare feet, small ones, a child's size. They crossed our yard, crossed the shoulder of the gravel road, and continued up the grass of the last yard, straight to the porch of the little white house with the green shutters. They stopped at the porch steps. I stood in my own yard with the rifle in my hand and the flashlight in the other, and I stared at that house. The porch light was off. The windows were dark. The old blue Ford was in the drive, as it always was, with its windshield dusted in pollen. There was no movement anywhere. I went back inside. I brought Emma into our bedroom, and she slept between me and my wife until morning, and neither of us got another minute of sleep. At first light, I walked down to the last house. I was angry by then, and scared, and I had a lot of things I wanted to say. I pounded on the front door. There was no answer. I pounded again. Still nothing. I walked around to the side of the house and I looked through a window, cupping my hand against the glass. The house was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. No furniture, no curtains. A thin film of dust on the hardwood floor. A light fixture hanging from the ceiling with the bulb missing. A for sale sign lying face down in the corner of the living room, as if someone had taken it down from the yard and tossed it inside. I went back to the front door, and that's when I noticed the realtor's lockbox hanging from the knob. A little gray metal box with a keypad on it, the kind agents use for showings. I looked at it for a long time. I walked back up the road to Darlene's house, and I knocked on her door. When she came out in her robe, I asked her, as directly as I could, how long that last house had been empty. She looked at me for a long moment, and she said, quietly, "Honey, nobody's lived in that house in over 2 years." She told me the last family, an older couple, we had moved out in 2019, after their daughter died in a car accident up on the parkway. She told me the house had been for sale ever since. She told me she'd never seen a child at that house in all the years she'd lived on the road. I moved my family out of that house by the end of October. I told my wife it was the schools. I told her it was the commute. I told her a lot of things. Emma's window was replaced before we moved. The crack was never explained. Nothing ever came into our yard again, as far as I know. But I still think about that boy sometimes, standing in the dusk in his gray t-shirt, in a yard in front of a house nobody lived in, watching a road that must have looked to him like a procession of strangers moving through his home. I think about what he told me. I think about the fact that he was right about the window. And in the worst hours of the night, I lie awake and I wonder what he would have done if I hadn't moved her bed. My grandmother's farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt lane about 4 miles outside a town so small it didn't have its own post office, tucked into one of those folded-up valleys in southwest Virginia where the mountains seemed to be leaning over you all the time. She'd lived there alone for the better part of 30 years after my grandfather passed, and she was a stubborn woman, the kind who could split her own firewood at 75 and shoot the head off a copperhead from 20 feet. When she had her stroke in the spring of my 28th year, my mother called me in Richmond and told me straight out that Granny couldn't live alone anymore, and that the family needed someone to move in with her, and that I was the one without a wife or children or any good excuse. I packed up my apartment over a weekend, and I drove down into that valley the following Tuesday, and I ended up staying for almost 2 years. The farmhouse had 2 neighbors. On the west side, half a mile down the lane, was an old man named Clem who we barely saw. On the east side, separated from us by a split-rail fence and a narrow strip of yard, was Miss Ada. She was in her 70s then, a small woman, not more than 5 feet tall, with white hair she wore in a tight bun and a face that was all sharp lines and bird-quick eyes. She'd been a widow longer than I'd been alive. She lived in a neat little white house with a wraparound porch, and what you noticed about her property right away was the garden. It wasn't a garden so much as a small farm, really a fenced-in rectangle behind her house that must have been 40 feet by 60, laid out in perfect rows, growing more food than one woman could possibly eat in a year. Tomatoes on cattle panels, pole beans on teepees, corn along the back, squash and cucumbers and peppers and okra and greens and herbs, all of it so well tended that not a single weed showed between the rows. I remember standing at our kitchen window the first morning I was there, looking out at her garden and thinking that in my whole life, in the suburbs, I'd never seen anything grow like that. Miss Ada came over the second day to introduce herself. She brought a jar of pickled beets and a small tin of shortbread cookies, and she stood at our kitchen door, talking to my grandmother in that soft, careful way country women talk to each other when one of them has been sick. She was perfectly polite to me. She asked how long I was planning to stay and told me to holler if I needed anything. And then, as she was leaving, she turned at the door and she said, in a voice that was suddenly different, flatter, harder, that there was one thing she needed to tell me. She said, "Don't ever come into my garden, not for anything." I remember laughing a little, thinking she was joking about thieves or something. She didn't laugh back. She looked at me with those sharp little eyes, and she said it again. "Not for anything. Not even if something of yours blows over the fence. You come tell me and I'll fetch it out myself." Her eyes didn't blink the whole time she said it. Then she thanked Granny again for the hospitality, and she walked back across the yard to her own house. My grandmother didn't say anything about it that night. I asked her, gently, why Miss Ada was so particular about her garden. Granny just said that Ada was an old woman with her own ways, and that some people had strong feelings about their property, and that it cost us nothing to respect her wishes. I left it alone. I've always been the kind of person who lets other people's quirks be their own. I figured maybe she'd had a bad experience with kids or a bad neighbor once. Maybe she used some particular fertilizer or some heirloom seed that she didn't want trampled. Maybe she just liked her space. I put it out of my mind. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I got into a rhythm with Granny. I drove her to her physical therapy appointments in town, cooked her meals, helped her to the bathroom at night. She slept in the downstairs bedroom, and I took the upstairs room that used to be my mother's, and we got on well enough. Miss Ada brought food over every Sunday. Regular as clockwork, a loaf of sourdough, a jar of apple butter, a basket of the first tomatoes of the season. She was kind to Granny, and Granny was kind back. And from our kitchen window, I could watch Miss Ada working in her garden every day, moving slowly between the rows with her long-handled hoe, tending her plants with a patience that was almost religious. The thing with the dog happened in late June. Granny had an old blue tick hound named Boone, maybe 12 years old, gentle as could be, mostly deaf and mostly blind and mostly content to lie on the porch and chase rabbits in his sleep. One afternoon I had him out in the yard on his long lead while I was pulling weeds from around Granny's hydrangeas, and somehow he slipped his collar. I looked up and saw his tail disappearing under the split rail fence into Miss Ada's property. I cussed and dropped my trowel and ran after him. I vaulted the fence without thinking. Boone had trotted into the tomato rows and was nosing around the base of one of the plants. I called him, and he looked at me and wagged his tail and didn't move, the way deaf old dogs do. I walked into the garden to get him, and that's when I heard Miss Ada's back door slam, and her voice shrill, furious, unrecognizable from the soft woman I'd been sharing Sunday bread with, screaming at me to get out. Get out! Get out of my garden! Get out! She was coming across the yard faster than a woman her age had any right to move. Her hands clenched into little fists, her face gone a color I'd never seen a human face go before. I grabbed Boone by the scruff. I was halfway out already, apologizing, telling her I was sorry. The dog got loose. I'd never do it again. She didn't stop screaming until I was back over the fence. But in those 30 seconds I was in her garden. My eyes did what eyes do when you're in a place you're not supposed to be. They looked around. They took everything in. And something at the back of the garden caught my attention, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it in the 12 years since. Near the back corner of that garden, tucked between the last of the tomato rows and the fence line, was a rectangle of bare dirt, maybe 6 feet long, maybe 2.5 feet wide. While everything around it grew wild and lush, that rectangle had nothing on it. Not a weed, not a blade of grass, not a single green thing. The dirt was packed smooth, as if someone had been tamping it down for years. It was not square, it was not round. It was long and narrow, the way a person's body is long and narrow. And while I was staring at it for what couldn't have been more than 2 seconds, before I was over the fence, I realized that Boone, who had been happily sniffing around the tomatoes moments before, was refusing to go anywhere near that patch of dirt. He had stopped at the edge of it and his hackles were up and his ears were back, and he was doing that low rumble in his chest that hound dogs do when something is wrong that they don't have words for. I apologized to Miss Ada over the fence for another 5 minutes. She finally calmed down enough to tell me that she hadn't meant to yell, that she was just very particular about her garden, that she understood it had been an accident. She thanked me for getting the dog out quickly, but her hands were still trembling, and I noticed that she positioned herself between me and the fence, between me and the inside of that garden for the entire conversation, as if she was worried I might try to go back in. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that rectangle of bare ground in my head. I kept hearing the rumble in Boone's chest. Around 11 I went downstairs for a glass of water, and I found Granny awake in her recliner in the living room, her Bible open on her lap. She looked up at me when I came in, and she patted the arm of the chair next to hers for me to sit down. I sat. She reached out and took my wrist in her hand, and I remember being surprised at how hard her grip was for a woman recovering from a stroke. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "You need to stay out of her garden." I told her I knew. I told her it was an accident. She shook her head. She said that wasn't what she meant. She said she wanted to tell me something that she had never told me or my mother or anyone outside of this holler, and that I needed to hear it and then never speak of it to Miss Ada. Not ever. I waited. She told me that Miss Ada's husband had been named Wilbur. He was, by Granny's account, a mean drunk. He had beaten Ada for years. Everyone in the holler knew. The sheriff knew. Her own brothers knew. Nobody did anything, because in those days, in those mountains, nobody did. And then in the summer of 1987, Wilbur had gone off. That was how Granny said it, gone off. He had left, supposedly, though no one ever saw him leave. No car was missing. His clothes were still in the closet, Ada told people. But Wilbur was gone, and Ada would not discuss it, and after a while nobody asked her about it anymore. Granny said the garden started the next summer. Ada had never gardened before. She had always said she didn't have the patience for it. But the summer after Wilbur went off, she put in a garden behind the house, and by the end of that year, it was the most productive plot in the whole valley. And every year since, for 36 years, the year I was sitting there with Granny Ada's garden had never failed. Not a drought year, not a wet year, not a cold spring, nothing. The soil back there, Granny said, was the richest soil anyone had ever seen, and the only thing anyone knew for certain was that Miss Ada did not let a single living soul set foot in that garden. Not ever. Not for any reason. Granny let go of my wrist then. She didn't tell me she knew what was back there. She didn't accuse Miss Ada of anything. She just said, one more time, that I was to stay out of that garden for as long as I lived next to Ada, and that if a dog or a ball or anything else I loved ever went over that fence, I was to let it go, and she would understand, and so would God. Then she closed her Bible and told me to help her to bed. I never went in that garden again. Miss Ada brought us sourdough and pickled beets and tomatoes for the next year and a half, until Granny passed in her sleep the following winter. I moved back to Richmond after the funeral. Miss Ada came to the service. She hugged me at the grave and told me Granny had been a fine woman and that she would miss her terribly. I watched her walk back to her old pickup afterward, this tiny white-haired woman in a black dress, and I remember thinking that she looked so small and so sad that it was hard to believe any of what I'd been thinking for the past year and a half. I drove out of the valley that evening, and I never went back. Miss Ada is in her 80s now. I called the woman who bought my grandmother's place a few years ago, just to ask after things, and she mentioned in passing that Ada was still there, still alive, still tending that garden every single day, and that it was still the best producing plot in the whole holler. I didn't ask her any other questions about it. I didn't want to know. I hope Miss Ada lives to be 100. I hope she keeps her garden until the end. I hope nobody ever goes over that fence. Because that patch of ground at the back, the long, narrow one where nothing grows, has stayed with me every summer of my life since, and I find myself thinking about it in the strangest moments when I'm cooking dinner, when I'm driving to work, when I'm drifting off to sleep, and every time I think about it, I find myself hoping, in some quiet way I don't entirely understand, that whatever is under there stays under there and never has any reason to come up. I rented that cabin in western North Carolina. The fall I was trying to finish my dissertation, a little one-bedroom place up a logging road where the pavement runs out, and the washboard gravel begins, and the signal on your cell phone drops to 1 bar if you're lucky. The cabin belonged to a man in Asheville who had inherited it from his father and didn't much want to deal with it, and he rented it to me for $400 a month on the condition that I didn't complain about the well water tasting like iron. I wasn't going to complain. I had a stack of research books, a laptop, a kerosene heater, and 6 months to write, and the only thing I wanted in the world was to be somewhere quiet enough to hear myself think. The cabin sat at the back of a small clearing that had been cut out of the pines maybe 50 years before, and from my kitchen window I could look out across about 200 yards of open ground to another small structure at the far edge of the clearing. A single wide trailer, sun faded to a pale yellow, with the skirting sagging off the sides and the windows dark. I assumed the trailer was abandoned from the first day I saw it. There was no vehicle parked near it. There were no lights in the windows at night. The little dirt track that led up to it from the main road was grown over with knee-high grass, the kind of grass that tells you nobody has driven down a path in at least a year. The mailbox at the end of the track was hanging open, the metal flag bent flat, the inside full of leaves and cobwebs. I asked the landlord about it the first week, and he told me the place belonged to an old man who had passed away some time back, and that the property was tied up in an estate dispute between his children, and that nobody had lived in the trailer for a long while. He said I shouldn't worry about it. I didn't. I had bigger things to worry about, like the chapter on land use policy that wasn't writing itself. For the first 3 weeks I was there, the only sounds at night were the wind in the pines and the occasional call of a barred owl from somewhere up the ridge. The cabin had an old rotary dial landline, which the landlord had left hooked up because cell service was unreliable, and he said it was good to have in case of emergencies. I used it maybe twice in those first 3 weeks, to call my advisor and to order propane. Otherwise it sat on the little side table in the kitchen, and I barely thought about it. The first call came on a Thursday night, around 2:15 in the morning. I was a light sleeper. The ring of that old phone was the kind of clanging, full metal bell that you don't hear anymore, and it brought me out of bed with my heart already pounding. I stumbled into the kitchen in my socks and I grabbed the receiver and I said hello. There was no answer. There was only breathing. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't the kind of heavy breathing obscene call that people joked about in movies. It was steady and slow and patient, in and out, the sound of a person who was sitting somewhere quiet and listening. I said hello again. I said it a third time. The breathing continued without change. I hung up the phone. I stood in the dark kitchen for a minute or two, trying to shake the feeling. I told myself it was a wrong number, a crossed line, some drunk kid in town who had dialed my landline by accident. I went back to bed. I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. The second call came the next night, at almost the same time, 2:10 in the morning. The third came the night after. By the end of the week, it was happening every single night, always between 1 and 4 in the morning, sometimes once a night, sometimes twice. I always picked up. I don't know why. Each time, it was the same steady breathing on the other end. I tried saying different things. I tried threats. I tried telling whoever it was that I was going to call the police. Nothing changed. The breathing would continue for maybe 30 seconds after I picked up, and then there would be a soft click, and the line would go dead. I checked the phone bill for incoming call records. There were no incoming calls listed. None. After the 5th or 6th night, I unplugged the phone from the wall. I took the cord out of the jack and I coiled it on top of the receiver, and I left the whole thing sitting on the kitchen table, disconnected. I slept better that night than I had in a week. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The phone rang at 2 in the morning. A disconnected rotary phone with no cord in the wall rang. I lay in my bed in the dark and I listened to it ring, and I told myself I was dreaming. It rang 8 times and then it stopped. I didn't get up. I didn't check it. I lay there with my eyes open until the gray dawn came through the window. In the morning, I walked into the kitchen and I looked at the phone on the table. The cord was still coiled on top of the receiver. The jack in the wall was empty. I picked up the receiver and I held it to my ear. There was no dial tone. It was a dead instrument. I plugged it back in because not plugging it in had somehow made it worse, and I tried to convince myself that the ringing had been a dream or a trick of a half-asleep mind. The next night it rang again at 2:30. I picked it up that time. The breathing was there, slow and patient and listening. But this time, after maybe 15 seconds of it, I heard something else in the background. A very faint sound, almost below the threshold of hearing. It was the sound of another rotary phone, ringing very far away. A kind of thin, tinny ring, the way you'd hear a phone in someone else's apartment through a wall. It rang once, twice, 3 times, 4. On the 4th ring, the breathing on my end paused, and I heard the distant sound of a receiver being picked up. Then the breathing continued, and a minute later the line went dead. I carried the kerosene lamp into the kitchen that night, and I stood at the window, and I looked out across the clearing. The cabin was dark, the pines were dark, everything was dark, except through one of the windows of that abandoned single-wide on the far side of the clearing, there was a faint orange glow. It was small, dim, like a single candle flame. I stared at it. I stared for so long that my eyes started to water. And then, against the glow, I saw the silhouette of a man. He was sitting upright. He was not moving. His head was tilted slightly, the way a person's head tilts when they are holding something to their ear, a receiver, maybe, a rotary phone. I don't remember getting dressed. I remember being in my truck with my keys in the ignition, and I remember driving down that washboard road faster than I should have. And I remember pulling up in front of the little sheriff's office in town at something like 4 in the morning, with the sun not yet up and the street lights buzzing over an empty main street. The deputy on duty was a young man named Hollister. He listened to my story with the kind of polite patience that small-town cops reserve for people who come in at 4 in the morning with wild stories. He asked me to start over. I started over. I told him about the cabin, about the trailer across the clearing, about the calls, about unplugging the phone, about the ringing anyway, about the silhouette in the window. It was when I described the trailer, the yellow siding, the sagging skirting, the overgrown track, the mailbox full of cobwebs that Hollister's face changed. The polite patience went out of him all at once, and he went a kind of pale I've only seen on a person's face a handful of times in my life. He stood up without saying anything, and he walked over to a filing cabinet, and he pulled out a manila folder. He sat back down and he looked through it for a minute. Then he set it down on the desk between us and he said, very carefully, that the trailer I was describing had been condemned by the county 9 years earlier. He told me the old man who had lived in it had been named Earl Petty. He had been a widower. He had lived alone in that trailer for about 20 years. He didn't drive. He didn't have visitors. His only contact with the outside world had been an old rotary phone he kept on his kitchen counter, which he used to call his sister in Tennessee once a week on Sunday evenings. When the sister missed 3 Sundays in a row, she had called the sheriff's department and asked them to check on Earl. They had found him sitting at his kitchen table with the receiver of the rotary phone still in his hand. The coroner said he had been dead for at least 2 weeks. A stroke, probably. He had been trying to call someone. Hollister said the trailer had been tagged as uninhabitable after that. The power had been shut off at the pole. The phone lines to that trailer had been cut and capped by the phone company because the family didn't want any more bills coming in and nobody was going to live there. Hollister said he knew this because he had been the deputy who had found Earl, and he had been there the day the phone company came out. He had watched them cut the line himself. That was 9 years ago. Nothing had lived in that trailer since, as far as anyone in town knew. He asked me if I wanted to file a report. I asked him what he would put in the report. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, slowly, that he wasn't sure. He said he could write down that I had been receiving harassing phone calls. He said he could note the complaint about the light in the trailer and send someone up to look at it in the morning. But he said, and I could tell he was choosing his words with a great deal of care, that he had seen strange things in this county over the years, and that some of them had explanations and some of them didn't, and that if I was asking his honest advice as one man to another, he would tell me to go back to the cabin, pack what I could in an hour, and not spend another night up there. He said it with the quiet weight of a man who was not speculating. I drove back up the mountain. The sun was just coming up over the ridge. I pulled into the clearing, and I looked out at the trailer one more time in the pale morning light. It looked exactly as abandoned as it had always looked. The grass, the mailbox, the dead windows. but I didn't get out of the truck and walk over to check it. I went inside and I packed 2 duffel bags and my laptop and I left almost everything else. I didn't even unplug the phone. I drove out of there before 10 in the morning and I didn't look back. I finished my dissertation in a studio apartment in Asheville. The landlord kept my deposit. I never asked him why. I never told him what had happened. I have never lived somewhere with a landline again. I don't like the sound of phones ringing in the middle of the night. I have friends who call me superstitious about it, and I let them think what they want. But sometimes, when I can't sleep, I think about Earl Petty, sitting at his kitchen table with that receiver in his hand, trying to reach someone. And I think about how long he might have sat there, and I wonder if the line was really cut, or if maybe some calls don't need a line at all. I wonder if he's still trying to get through. And I wonder, in the hours just before dawn, whether the person he is finally, patiently, endlessly reaching for is me. I grew up in a coal town in southeastern Ohio, right up against the West Virginia line, in that corner of the state where people will tell you they're not really Ohioans so much as Appalachians, who happened to be on the wrong side of the river. The town was called Millersburg, though there was no Miller and no Berg worth mentioning. And by the time I was born in the late 70s, the mines had mostly closed and the place was already shrinking year by year. My childhood was a quiet one. A brick elementary school, a single blinking yellow light at the one intersection, a Methodist church, a hardware store, and a handful of streets lined with small 2-story houses that had been built for miners' families a century before. We lived on Poplar Street, 3 blocks off the main road, and 4 houses down from us, on the same side of the street, was the Brent house. The Brents were a family of 4, a mother, a father, and 2 little girls. The father was a thin, quiet man who always wore a dark blue button-down shirt and gray work pants, no matter the season. The mother was a small woman with brown hair pinned back from her face, and she wore a faded yellow hausa dress with tiny white flowers on it, the kind of dress women stopped wearing around 1962. The girls looked to be maybe 6 and 8. The older one had long brown hair and 2 braids, and the younger one had the same hair but cut to her shoulders. They both wore old-fashioned play dresses, the kind with little Peter Pan collars, and they both wore white ankle socks and black buckle shoes. I remember all of this in detail because the Brents were a family you remembered. You saw them and you thought, those people look like they stepped out of an old photograph. My mother would sometimes say exactly that, under her breath, when we'd drive past their house on the way to the store. I must have been about 8 years old the first time my mother said the thing that I didn't understand until I was older. We were walking home from the library on a Saturday afternoon, and we passed the Brent house, and the 2 girls were on the front porch playing jacks. I remember waving at them. They didn't wave back. My mother took my hand and walked me a little faster, and when we were past the house, she said, almost to herself, "Those poor people. They've been here since I was a girl." I asked her what she meant. She looked down at me and she seemed to think for a moment about what to say. Then she just said that the Brent family had lived in that same house for a very long time. I asked if the girls I had just seen were the original girls or their daughters or granddaughters or what. She didn't answer. She just squeezed my hand and told me to mind my own business about the Brents, because it wasn't polite to speculate about other people's families. I laughed it off at the time. Kids don't really think about time the way adults do. I figured my mother had gotten mixed up, or the Brents just kept having little girls who looked like the ones before. I went on with my life. I went to school. I made friends. I rode my bike up and down Poplar Street 1,000 times over the next several years. And I started to notice things that I had been too young to notice before. The Brent girls were always the same ages. I was 8 when I first really saw them, and I was 12 when I first really thought about it, and the older girl still looked exactly 8, and the younger one still looked exactly 6. When I was 14 and on the high school basketball team, I drove past their house one afternoon on my way home from practice, and the 2 girls were out on the porch jumping rope, and they looked exactly as they had when I was in the 3rd grade. I slowed down. I stared. The older one turned and looked at me, and her face was the same face I remembered. I drove home that evening and I asked my mother, point blank, how old the Brent girls were. She was peeling potatoes at the kitchen sink. She didn't turn around. She just said, "I don't know, honey," and then she changed the subject. I started paying closer attention after that. The parents didn't age either. Mr. Brent always had the same dark hair, combed flat to one side, and the same thin, clean-shaven face, and the same dark blue shirt, and the same gray work pants. Mrs. Brent's hair never grayed. Her dress never wore out. They both moved the same way year after year, with a kind of slow, measured patience, as if they had nowhere to be and plenty of time to get there. They came and went from the house, but I never saw them drive a car. I never saw them get groceries. I never saw them receive visitors. I never saw them go to church, though ours was the only Protestant church in town. I once asked my father, when I was 15 or so, what Mr. Brent did for work. My father was a union man who had worked the mines until they closed, and then drove a truck for a beverage distributor, and he knew most of the men in the county. He just shook his head and said, "Brent?" Can't say I ever asked. He said it in a way that meant the conversation was over. The first real shock came the summer I was 16. I had a summer job at the public library, shelving books and helping the librarian, Mrs. Hemphill, catalog the local history collection. The library kept a set of bound volumes of old school yearbooks and community photo books going back to the early 1900s. One afternoon, I was flipping through a photo book from 1962, a collection of pictures from that year's 4th of July parade down the main street of town. I was looking at the pictures idly, just passing time on a slow afternoon. And in one of the photographs, a shot of a crowd standing along the sidewalk watching the parade go by, I saw Mr. Brent. He was in the background, maybe 5 people back in the crowd, but his face was perfectly clear. Dark hair combed flat to one side, thin, clean-shaven face, dark blue button-down shirt. Standing with his arms at his sides, watching the parade with no particular expression, I felt my stomach turn over. I flipped to the front of the book and looked at the publication date, 1962. I did the math. That photograph had been taken 32 years before I was looking at it. Mr. Brent had to be at least 55 or 60 years old in the picture, judging by the rest of the adults around him. Except he wasn't. He looked 35. He looked exactly as he did when I had driven past him mowing his little lawn the previous Sunday afternoon. I stared at that picture for a long, long time. I checked the other photographs in the book. I found him twice more, standing in different crowds at different events in 1962, wearing the same clothes, the same expression. I found Mrs. Brent in one of them, standing a few feet away from him with her arms folded, wearing the yellow house dress with the little white flowers. I couldn't find the girls in any of the photographs, but I was already feeling sick enough that I closed the book and put it back on the shelf, and I didn't tell Mrs. Hemphill what I had found. I tried to tell my mother that night. She was washing dishes. I started to say it, started to tell her I had seen something in a library book that she needed to know about, and she cut me off before I could get it out. She turned off the water. She dried her hands on a dish towel. She looked at me very seriously, and she said, "If this is about the Brents, I don't want to hear it." I stood there not knowing what to say. She said, "Some families in these hills decided a long time ago not to move on. That's their business. It's not yours, and it's not mine. You leave them alone. You don't stare at them. You don't ask questions. You don't go near that house. Do you understand me?" I said I did. She turned the water back on and went back to washing dishes. I never brought it up again while I lived in that house. I left Millersburg when I was 18 to go to college down at Ohio State, and I didn't think much about the Brents for a long time. I got a degree. I got a job in Columbus. I got married. I had my own daughter. The years went by. My father got sick in the spring of my 34th year, and he passed in the fall. The funeral was in Millersburg, at the Methodist church I had grown up in, and I drove back for 3 days to be with my mother and help her with the arrangements. The day after the funeral, my mother asked me to run to the little grocery store in town to pick up some milk and bread and a few other things. I said I would. I drove to the store in her car. I was in the bread aisle when I looked up and saw them. The Brents were shopping, all 4 of them. Mr. Brent was pushing the cart in his dark blue button-down shirt and gray work pants. Mrs. Brent was walking beside him in her yellow house dress with the little white flowers. The 2 girls were following behind, the older one with her long brown braids, the younger one with her shoulder-length hair, both in their little play dresses and white ankle socks and black buckle shoes. They looked exactly as they had the day I left Millersburg for college, 16 years before. They looked exactly as they had the day my mother had walked me home from the library when I was 8. They looked exactly as Mr. Brent had looked in a photograph taken in 1962. I stood in the bread aisle and I couldn't move. My hand was on a loaf of white bread, and I couldn't make my hand let go of it. The older girl, the one with the braids, looked up from her mother's cart. She looked across the store. She looked directly at me. And then she smiled, and she raised her small hand, and she gave me a little wave, like she knew me, like she recognized me, like she remembered the 8-year-old boy who had once walked past her porch on a Saturday afternoon with his mother, 30 years before, and she was saying hello to him again, the way an old friend might. I left the grocery store without buying anything. I got in the car, and I sat in the parking lot for a long time with my hands on the steering wheel. When I finally got home, my mother was in the kitchen making sandwiches for the people who were still coming by the house with casseroles. I told her what I had seen. Her whole body went still. She didn't turn to look at me. She said, very quietly, that she didn't want to hear it. I told her I needed to talk about it. She said no. She said that she had told me when I was a boy, and she was telling me now as a grown man, that the Brents had made their own choices a long time ago, and that it wasn't for us to understand, and that the sooner I put it out of my head, the better. And then, without looking at me, she said something I have thought about every single day since. She said, some of them never left, and some of the ones who did came back, and some of them, honey, were never really ours to begin with. You leave it alone. She died 4 years later, in her sleep, in the same bed she had shared with my father for 41 years. I came home for her funeral too. I drove past Poplar Street on my way to the church. I didn't look at the Brent house on purpose. I kept my eyes on the road, but out of the corner of my eye, I could see movement on the porch. The shape of 2 small girls, the shape of a woman in a yellow dress, the shape of a thin man standing beside her. I haven't been back to Millersburg since. I don't know if the Brents are still there. I suspect they are. I suspect they always will be. And sometimes, late at night, when my own daughter is asleep, and my wife is asleep, and the house is quiet, I find myself thinking about the way that little girl waved at me in the grocery store, and I find myself wondering, in a way I don't want to wonder, whether the child she was waving at was really me, or whether it was some other version of me, a boy I didn't quite remember, who had walked past her porch one afternoon and never quite left. My wife Rachel and I bought our house in a little mountain town in eastern Tennessee the year we turned 36, the year we'd both finally given up on having children, and decided that what we really needed instead was a project. The town had maybe 400 people in it, 1 stoplight on Main Street, a post office that shared a building with the library, and a single diner that opened at 5 in the morning for the farmers and closed at 2 in the afternoon. Our house was a 2-story farmhouse on a half-acre lot at the edge of town, built sometime in the 1920s, and it had been empty for 7 years when we bought it. The paint was peeling off in long strips. The back porch was sagging. The kitchen still had the original linoleum from 1954. We paid $62,000 for it, and we moved in the first week of April. And we spent that entire spring happier than we'd been in years, because we had a project and we had each other and we had a porch swing that, once I fixed the chain, worked just fine. The house next to ours on the right side belonged to a couple in their mid-40s, named Dennis and Marla Creech. We met them the second day we were there. They came over and stood in our front yard while we unloaded boxes, and they introduced themselves in that polite, reserved mountain way where you can tell people are looking you over carefully without being obvious about it. Dennis was a stocky, balding man with a gray beard trimmed close to his face, and he wore mechanic's coveralls, even though I never saw him drive to a job. Marla was a thin woman with long, straight brown hair shot through with gray, and she wore plain cotton dresses, and never, in the 4 years we lived next to her, did I see her in shoes other than a pair of white sneakers. They were polite. They welcomed us. They told us to let them know if we needed anything. And then they went back to their house, and in all the time we lived next to them after that, they never invited us inside, never came over for coffee, and never stopped in the yard to chat for more than 2 or 3 minutes at a time. Their house was a 1-story brick place, built maybe in the early 60s, with a low-pitched roof and a small attached carport. The whole structure sat up on a crawl space, maybe 2 feet off the ground, and the crawl space was completely bricked in on all 4 sides, which was a little unusual. Most crawl spaces in old houses have lattice panels or vented siding. Theirs was solid brick, mortared in, with only one small rectangular vent at the back of the house, down near the ground, covered by a rusted metal grate. I noticed it the first time I walked around the property line to check our fence, because it struck me as strange that someone would go to the trouble of bricking in an entire crawl space when anything built in this country back then was supposed to breathe a little. I didn't think much about it at the time. People do strange things to old houses. The smell started about 3 months after we moved in the first real heat of July. I noticed it one evening while Rachel and I were sitting on our back porch drinking iced tea after dinner. It drifted over on a light breeze from the direction of the Creech house. It was sweet. That's the part I remember most. Sweet and rotten, the kind of smell you get when you leave meat in a trash bag in the car in the summer and don't find it for 3 days. I asked Rachel if she smelled it. She made a face and said yes. We figured an animal had died somewhere under their house or in their walls, and we went back inside and closed the windows on that side of the house. The smell stayed for the rest of that summer. Some days it was worse than others. When the wind was from the south, we hardly noticed it. When it was still, or when there was a light breeze from the north, it would drift across our yard and we couldn't sit on the back porch at all. By the middle of August, I'd had enough, and I went over one afternoon to talk to Dennis about it. I was as gentle as I could be. I didn't want to be the neighbor who complained about smells in the country. I told him I thought an animal might have died under his house, and I wondered if he'd noticed it. He looked at me for a moment with those small, careful eyes, and then he nodded and said yes, he'd smelled it too. He said it was a possum that had gotten in through the vent. He said he'd been meaning to deal with it, but his back had been giving him trouble, and he'd get to it soon. I thanked him. I went home. I told Rachel. She said that was that then. The smell didn't go away. Not that week, not that month, not the rest of that summer. By the time the first frost came in October and the smell finally died off, we had both been holding our breaths every time we walked out to the mailbox for 2 solid months. The following spring, when the weather turned warm again, the smell came back. I remember standing in our backyard one April afternoon, smelling it for the first time that year, and feeling a cold sink in my stomach. Rachel and I talked about calling the county that first week, but we'd just moved to a town of 400 people, and we didn't want to be the new folks who sicked code enforcement on their neighbors. So we didn't. We bore it for another summer. Dennis never mentioned it again, and I didn't bring it up to him. He and Marla came and went from their house the way they always did, quiet, polite, distant. Sometimes I'd see him out in the yard cutting the grass with an old push mower. Sometimes I'd see her out on their little front stoop shelling beans into a metal bowl. They never had visitors that I saw, not once in all those years. Their gravel drive never had a car in it other than Dennis's old brown pickup. The second summer, the smell got worse. The third summer, it was so bad that by the middle of July, we couldn't open our windows at all on that side of the house, even at night when the air cooled down. I talked to Dennis again the third summer. I was less gentle this time. I told him straight out that the smell had been going on for 3 years, and we were tired of it. He apologized. He said he'd get to it that weekend. He didn't. The smell was still there in September. It was the 4th summer, the summer of what I'm telling you about, that things finally came to a head. That August was one of the hottest in memory. The smell rolled off the Creech house in waves. Rachel came in from hanging laundry one afternoon, pale and shaking, and she said she had retched in the yard. That night she called the county. She did it from our kitchen while I sat at the table and didn't stop her. She told the woman on the phone, calmly and clearly, that there was a smell coming from our neighbor's house that had been going on for 4 years, and that she believed something had died under the structure and never been removed. A sheriff's deputy came out the next morning. He was a young man, maybe 26, with a buzz cut and the kind of polite demeanor that small-town deputies have with anyone over 40. I walked outside when I saw his cruiser pull up, and I stood on our front walk as he went to the Creech door and knocked. He knocked 3 times. There was no answer. Dennis's truck was in the drive. The front curtains didn't move. He knocked again, harder, and called out. Nothing. He came back down the steps and he said he was going to walk around the property to check on things, and he asked if I would come with him, as the neighbor who'd made the call. I said I would. We walked around the side of the house to the back. The smell back there was so strong it hit us like a wall. The deputy stopped dead. He didn't say anything for about 10 seconds. Then he walked slowly up to the small vent at the back of the foundation. He crouched down. He leaned forward and he looked through the metal grate. And I watched his shoulders go stiff. I watched the color drain out of the back of his neck. He straightened up slowly and he stepped back from the wall, and he took his radio off his belt, and he walked out into the middle of the yard, and he stood with his back to the house while he spoke into it. He spoke for a long time. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I saw him close his eyes at one point, and I saw him take a long breath, and when he was done, he turned to me and he said, very quietly, that he needed me and my wife to go back into our house and stay there. 3 more cruisers arrived within the hour, then a fire truck, then a county coroner's van, then 2 unmarked black SUVs with men in plain clothes. They strung yellow tape around the Creech property. Dennis and Marla never came out. I watched from our upstairs window, from behind the curtain, feeling like a child spying on something he knew he wasn't supposed to see. They didn't break the door down that first day. They stayed out back, around the vent. They had spotlights set up by the time it got dark. They worked through the night. Rachel and I didn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I heard one of the men outside retch loudly and call for a hose. They worked for 2 days. On the second afternoon, they finally broke open the bricked-in crawl space from the back, and they brought out thing after thing on blue tarps. I couldn't see what any of them were from our window. They were covered. They moved carefully. I counted the shapes as they came out. I counted more of them than I want to say here. Some of them were small. Nobody came to our door to tell us what had happened. The deputy I'd walked around the house with on the first morning never came back. A different officer, older, came by the next evening and asked Rachel and me a few questions about our neighbors. How long had we known them? Had we noticed any visitors? Had we ever heard anything? He took notes on a small pad, and he was polite, and he told us nothing. When Rachel asked him what they had found, he looked at her for a long moment, and he said, "Ma'am, I can't discuss an ongoing investigation." And that was all. The Creeches were never seen again. I don't know if they were arrested, or if they ran, or if they had been in that house the whole time something was being done in their crawl space, and they simply didn't answer the door for the deputy. I don't know where they went. I don't know if they were charged with anything. I watched the local paper for weeks, and I never saw a word about it. Not one line. In a town of 400 people, where a lost dog was front-page news, there was not a single mention of a 2-day crime scene investigation with 4 cruisers and a coroner's van. The story simply didn't exist. The house sat empty all that fall and winter. The yellow tape stayed up for a long time, and then someone took it down. In the spring, a bulldozer came and took the whole thing down in a single afternoon. The brick foundation, the walls, the roof, all of it. They hauled the debris away on 3 dump trucks. Then they put fresh topsoil over the whole lot and seeded it with grass. By the end of that summer, it was as if the Creech house had never existed. Just an empty green rectangle where a house used to be. Rachel and I stayed in that town for 2 more years before we sold our place and moved on. We never got a straight answer from anyone about what had been in that crawl space. I asked the old woman who ran the diner. I asked the pastor at the Methodist church. I asked the man who ran the hardware store. Every one of them gave me some version of the same answer. They looked at me for a moment, and then they said something vague, and then they changed the subject. One of them, an older man who'd lived in the town his whole life, came the closest to telling me something. He said, slowly, that there were families in those mountains who kept to themselves for reasons, and that sometimes those reasons went back further than anyone alive could remember, and that the best thing my wife and I could do was forget we'd ever lived next to them. He said it with a kindness that scared me more than anything else anyone had said. We left that valley and we never went back. I still think about that small rectangular vent at the back of the Creech house, and the way the deputy's shoulders went stiff when he looked through it, and the sweet, rotten smell that had drifted across our yard for 4 summers. I think about Dennis saying it was a possum, with those small, careful eyes. I think about Marla shelling beans into a metal bowl. And in the worst hours of the night, I think about how long that smell had been drifting over that neighborhood before Rachel and I ever moved in. And how many other neighbors must have sat on their own porches over the years, breathing it in and deciding, for one reason or another, that it really wasn't any of their business. I took the job at the regional hospital in Western North Carolina the fall I turned 31, after my marriage had quietly fallen apart in Charlotte, and I needed a clean start somewhere I didn't know anyone. The hospital was a small regional trauma center that served 4 counties, and the town it sat closest to was a place called Sweetwater, tucked into a cove at the base of the Blue Ridge, with a population of about 612, according to the sign at the edge of town. Sweetwater had one church, a small brick Baptist one, with a white steeple and a gravel parking lot. And the joke I heard within my first week was that if you wanted a second church, you had to drive 20 miles. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew everyone's business. And when I moved into my rental house on the second week of October, I suspect that by the following Sunday, everyone in town had already learned my name, my job, and the color of my car. The house was a small white clapboard with a screened-in front porch, set on a corner lot at the end of a quiet residential street called Hollins Road. It had 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a detached garage that leaned to one side, and a rent so low that I'd asked the landlord twice on the phone if I was hearing him right. His name was Mr. Pritchard, and he was a thin, elderly man with a slow voice. And he'd told me the rent was low because the house had sat empty for a while and he just wanted somebody in it. I didn't think to ask him why it had sat empty, and he didn't offer. I signed a 1-year lease, and I moved my things in over a single long weekend. The neighborhood was exactly the kind of place I'd hoped it would be. Every house on Hollins Road had a porch light that came on at dusk. Every yard was mowed. The older couple directly across the street, the Cawthons, waved at me every morning when I left for work. The woman 2 houses down walked her little beagle past my mailbox every afternoon at 4. People drove slowly. Kids rode bikes in the street on Saturday mornings. It was a place where, if you'd grown up in a city, you might roll your eyes at how wholesome it seemed. For me, after the year I'd had, it felt like a kind of salvation. The first Tuesday I lived in that house, I was sitting in the living room after a long shift, eating a frozen dinner and watching an old movie on cable. The clock on the cable box read 9:17 when there was a knock at my front door. 3 firm raps. Not hard enough to be angry, not soft enough to be apologetic. Just 3 businesslike knocks, the way a delivery driver might announce themselves. I set my plate down and walked to the door. The porch light was on. The screen door was latched. I opened the inside door and looked out. There was nobody on the porch. I opened the screen and stepped out onto the boards. The yard was empty. The street was empty. The Cawthons' house across the way was dark, except for the blue glow of their television in the front window. I stood out there for a full minute. There was no running child, no retreating figure, no car pulling away. Nothing. I went back inside. I chalked it up to kids. Every neighborhood in every small town has kids who ring doorbells or knock on doors and run. It didn't occur to me to think any more about it than that, and I finished my dinner and my movie and I went to bed. The next Tuesday, at 9:17 on the dot, there was a knock at my front door. 3 firm raps. This time I was already standing in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, and I had a clear line of sight through the front window. I saw the motion light on the porch come on a half second before the knocking started, triggered by something stepping into its sensor range. I hurried to the door. I opened it fast. There was nobody there. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. The street was empty. The motion light was still on. I stood in the doorway and I watched it until it timed out and clicked off 30 seconds later, and in that 30 seconds, nothing moved. Nothing walked away. Nothing crossed the yard. I stood on my porch for a long time that night. I remember looking up and down the street. I remember looking at my own mailbox, my own shrubs, my own driveway. I remember thinking that if it had been a kid, I would have heard them run. A child can't step off a porch that loud and disappear. They just can't. The boards on that porch creaked when I walked on them. I went back inside and I locked both the inner door and the screen door, which I hadn't been doing, and I sat up later than I should have, watching TV and not really watching it. By the 3rd Tuesday, I had started paying close attention. I made a point of being near my front window at 9 in the evening. At 9:17 exactly, the porch light clicked on, and 3 firm raps came from my front door. I didn't move this time. I stood there behind the curtain and I watched the porch. The light stayed on for its full 30 seconds. There was nothing on my porch. There were no feet. There was no shadow. There was no figure. But while I watched, the welcome mat at my front door, a simple brown bristle mat that I'd bought at the hardware store the week I moved in, shifted. Just a little, an inch, maybe two, toward the right. The way it would shift if someone had been standing on the edge of it and then stepped off. I did not answer the door that night. I called Mr. Pritchard the next morning. I told him, trying to sound reasonable, that I'd been having a strange experience on Tuesday nights at my house. I described the knocks. I described the empty porch. I described the mat. I asked him if the previous tenant had ever mentioned anything similar. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing. Finally, he said, slowly, that the previous tenant had complained about something similar and had broken her lease after only 3 months, and that he was sorry, but he didn't really know what to tell me. I asked him what she had complained about specifically. He said he didn't remember the details. I asked him how long the house had been in his family. He said it had been his wife's uncle's house before hers, and his uncle had bought it from the original owner in the 50s. He asked me, in a careful voice, if I wanted to break the lease. I told him I'd think about it. He said he wouldn't charge me a penalty if I decided to go. Then he said goodbye and hung up, and I sat there at the kitchen table thinking about the way he had said something similar and not liking it. The Cawthons across the street were friendly to me, but they were in their 70s, and I didn't want to bother them with strange questions. Instead, I crossed the street 2 doors down, to the little blue house, where an older woman named Mrs. Lenoir lived alone. I'd spoken to her once or twice at the mailboxes. She was probably 80, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, and she had the look of someone who had lived on Hollands Road her entire life. I knocked on her door on a Wednesday afternoon and she invited me in for coffee. We sat in her front room and made small talk for a while. Then I asked her, as casually as I could, if she knew anything about the history of the house I was renting. She looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup for a long moment. Then, she set it down on its saucer with the little ceramic click of a woman who has done that same motion 10,000 times. And she said, in the flattest, most matter-of-fact voice you can imagine, that the house had been built in 1946 by a man named Harlan Moss, who had lived in it alone until 1951, when he had been beaten to death on his own front porch by his next-door neighbor over a dispute about a property line. She said the neighbor had gone to prison for it. She said the neighbor had died in prison. She said Harlan Moss had been killed on a Tuesday night. She said the time of death, according to the paper from that week, had been right around 9:15 in the evening. And then she said, in that same flat voice, that Harlan still came back every Tuesday at that time to knock on the door he had been killed in front of, and that nobody in the neighborhood paid it any mind because he had never hurt anyone and he was only knocking. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It came out of me before I could stop it, a nervous, uncomfortable laugh. Mrs. Lenoir didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She just looked at me with her sharp gray eyes, and she waited for me to finish. And when I did, she said, "Young man, I have lived on this road for 72 years. I heard those knocks when I was a little girl. I heard them when I raised my own children. I hear them now. You don't have to believe me, but you asked." I went home that afternoon. I bought a little wireless camera on my way home from work on Friday, one of those small battery-powered ones that connects to your phone, and I set it up to face my front porch. I tested it twice. It recorded clearly. It had night vision. The motion sensor worked. The following Tuesday, I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand. At 9:16, I opened the live feed. The porch was empty. The welcome mat was in its usual spot. At 9:17, the motion light came on. The feed was crisp. I could see every board of the porch, the post of the railing, the edge of the mat. There was nobody on the porch. And yet, as I watched, I heard the 3 firm raps at my front door, clear as anything, coming from the direction of the camera. I saw nothing. The camera saw nothing. But as the knocks came, the welcome mat shifted on the boards. I watched it happen on the screen. It moved about 2 inches to the right, a smooth, deliberate shift, as if something standing on it had shifted its weight from one foot to the other, and then stepped back off. The motion light clicked off 30 seconds later. I sat there on my couch and I watched the footage back 3 times. It was the same every time. The empty porch, the light coming on, The sound of 3 firm knocks, the mat shifting, the light clicking off. I sent the video to a friend of mine back in Charlotte who worked in IT. He wrote back an hour later and said he couldn't find any evidence of tampering. He said the timestamps were consistent. He said the audio was original to the video. He said it was the strangest thing he'd ever seen, and he didn't know what to tell me. I didn't break the lease. I don't know why. Maybe because Mrs. Lenoir had been so calm about it, and something about her calm had made me feel that whatever it wasn't dangerous. Maybe because, in some way I didn't want to admit, I had started to feel that the knocking was not hostile. It was patient. It was the kind of knocking a man might do if he was coming home after a long day and he had forgotten his key, and he was hoping whoever was inside would hear him and let him in. It was the kind of knocking of someone who had been coming to that same door for a very long time, expecting something that never came. I lived in that house for the full year of my lease. Every Tuesday at 9:17, the porch light came on and the 3 firm raps came at my door. I stopped answering. I got used to it the way you get used to a freight train going by at the same time every night. Sometimes, near the end of my year there, I would put my hand flat on the inside of the door at 9:17 and I would feel, very faintly, the vibration of the knocks traveling through the wood. I never opened the door again. I never said anything to whoever was on the other side. I told myself that I didn't want to be rude, but the truth is I was afraid that if I ever said his name out loud on that porch, Harlan Moss might finally answer me, and I would have to go on living in that house knowing that he had. I moved out when my lease was up. I took a job at a different hospital, in a different state. The house on Hollins Road is still there. Mr. Pritchard rented it out to somebody else within a month of me leaving. I drove past it once, a few years later, when I was in the area for a wedding. The porch light was on. It was a Tuesday evening. It was not yet 9:17. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove through that little town and out the other side, and I found myself thinking, as I crossed back over the county line, that some doors never really close, and some men, once they start coming home, can't stop trying, and I hoped, for the sake of whoever was living in that house now, that they had learned, the way I had, to let him knock. My sister Lainey and I inherited our Uncle Burl's house in the summer of 2014. A small one-story on the edge of a town called Reeves Hollow, tucked up against the western foot of the Cumberland Plateau in Middle Tennessee. Uncle Burl was our mother's younger brother, a bachelor his whole life, and when he passed in his sleep at 73, the lawyer called us with the news that he had left his house and his 17 acres to the 2 of us, because we were the only family he had left. Neither Lainey nor I had any interest in moving to Reeves Hollow. The plan was to drive down from Nashville, clean the place out, fix whatever needed fixing, put it on the market, and split the proceeds. We gave ourselves 6 weeks. Lainey took time off from her law firm. I told the contractor I worked for that I needed a leave of absence, and the first week of June we loaded our trucks with tools and drove down into that narrow little valley where our uncle had lived alone for most of his adult life. The house was in rougher shape than we'd hoped. The roof needed patching, the porch needed new boards, the kitchen linoleum was coming up in the corners. But it was structurally sound, and between the 2 of us and what we knew about old houses, we figured we could get it ready to sell in the time we had. We worked long days. We woke up at 6, drank coffee on the front porch, and were up on ladders by 7. By the end of the first week, we were sore and dirty and deeply pleased with ourselves, and we had met our only real neighbor. Her name was Miss Junie Crocker. She lived in the little yellow house directly next door, maybe 30 yards from Uncle Burl's place through a patch of untended grass and a split-rail fence. She was, I would guess, somewhere in her late 70s or early 80s when we met her. She was small, slightly bent, with white hair she wore in a loose bun at the back of her neck and a round, soft face with bright blue eyes that crinkled when she smiled. She dressed in cotton house dresses with little blue flowers on them, and she always wore a clean white apron over the dress, as if she had come straight from a kitchen. She came over on our second morning with a pitcher of iced tea and 2 glasses on a little wooden tray, and from that day forward she came over almost every afternoon around 3, when the heat was at its worst, to make sure we were drinking enough water, and to sit on the porch steps and talk to us for a while. She was genuinely charming. That's the part that's hardest to reconcile. She told us stories about our Uncle Burl, who, according to her, had been a quiet, decent man who kept to himself and was kind to her whenever they crossed paths. She told us about the history of the Hollow, the old families who had lived there, the way the creek used to flood before the county put in the culvert. She told us she had lived alone in that little yellow house since her mother had passed in 1971, that she had never married, that she had no children of her own. She said that the Lord had given her a quiet life, and she was grateful for it. Lainey, who is slower to trust people than I am, had warmed to her by the end of the first week. By the end of the second, we were both fond of her. On a Wednesday in the middle of June, when the temperature hit 98 and the air in our uncle's unair-conditioned house was unbearable, Miss Junie invited us over to her place to cool off for a while. She said her window unit worked, and that she had just made lemonade, and that we shouldn't be sitting in that hot house when she had a cool one right next door. We didn't argue. We washed our hands at the garden hose and walked over. Her house was spotless. I remember that first. Spotless in a way that old people's houses sometimes are, where you can tell the same woman has been cleaning the same surfaces in the same order for 50 years. The front room had a floral patterned sofa, 2 matching chairs, a low coffee table with a lace runner, and a little china cabinet full of porcelain figurines. The whole house smelled faintly of potpourri, roses and lavender, the kind of smell you associate with your grandmother. She sat us down in the front room and went into the kitchen to pour the lemonade. The front room opened onto a short hallway that led, I assumed, to the bedrooms and the bathroom. From the sofa, I could see down the hall clearly. There were 4 doors. One on the left was open, and I could see it was a small bathroom white tile, a clawfoot tub, a little window above the sink. The other 3 doors were closed. Just 3 plain white doors, in a plain white hallway, with a plain hardwood floor. Nothing unusual about them at all. But as I sat there, sipping my lemonade and waiting for Miss Junie to come back from the kitchen, my eyes kept going back to those 3 closed doors. Lainey noticed me looking. She's always been the nosier of the 2 of us. When Miss Junie came back in with the lemonade, Lainey asked, in her friendliest voice, if Miss Junie had any hobbies, any collections, anything she liked to do to pass the time. Miss Junie said she did a little needlework, and she read her Bible, and she gardened in the spring. Lainey asked what was in the other rooms down the hall. She said it lightly, the way you'd ask a question in polite conversation. Miss Junie paused for just a moment, and then she smiled that warm, soft smile of hers, and she said, "Oh, those are just my storage rooms, dear. Nothing interesting. Just things I've kept over the years." She poured us more lemonade. We talked for another half hour. I finished my second glass and realized I needed to use the bathroom. I stood up and asked if I could. Miss Junie told me to go right down the hall. The door on the left was open. Just help myself. I walked down the hallway. I was, I'll admit, a little distracted. I was hot, I was tired, and the hallway was narrower than I expected, and the bathroom door, when I reached it, was the second door on the left from where I was standing, not the first as I'd thought. I got confused. I turned the wrong handle. I opened one of the 3 closed doors. I want to describe what I saw as carefully as I can, because the exact picture of it has stayed with me for more than 10 years. The room was not a bedroom. It had no bed. It had no dresser. It had no window. The room was maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, and every wall, floor to ceiling, was lined with clothing racks. They were the kind of metal racks you'd see in a dry cleaner's, chrome poles on wheeled bases, packed so closely together that you could barely walk between them. And on every rack, closely hung and facing the same direction, were children's clothes. There were hundreds of outfits, maybe more than 1,000. They were organized by size. The rack closest to the door held tiny infant onesies and little white christening gowns, yellowed with age. The rack behind it held slightly larger outfits, footed pajamas and bibs. The next held toddler-sized dresses and little pairs of corduroy overalls with snaps at the shoulders. The next held children's clothes, boys' button-down shirts and little plaid skirts with suspenders and small denim jumpers. The racks went back and back and back, each one a size larger, all the way to the far wall of the room. The clothes were old. Some of them were very old. I could see the styles of different decades, just from a glance. 40s-era baby bonnets, 50s pinafores, 60s sailor suits, 70s corduroys, 80s stirrup pants. All of them clean, all of them pressed, all of them hanging in perfect rows, like a little museum. There were no toys. There were no photographs. There were no children's books. There were no shoes. Just the clothes. Just the sized and organized and perfectly preserved clothes. I stood in the doorway for maybe 3 seconds. Then I pulled the door shut, very quietly, and I turned and I went into the bathroom and I closed that door too, and I leaned against the sink with my hands shaking, and I looked at myself in the little round mirror above it, and I tried to remember how to breathe like a normal person. I flushed the toilet, even though I hadn't used it. I ran the water. I came back out into the front room and I sat back down next to my sister, and I smiled, and I drank the rest of my lemonade, and I said nothing. I don't know how I did it. I really don't. I think some part of me understood that whatever Miss Junie's reason was for those clothes, I did not want to be the person who looked at her in her own living room and let her see in my eyes that I had seen them. We stayed for another 20 minutes. Miss Junie was as sweet as she had been all afternoon. She patted Lainey's hand when we left. She told us to come back anytime. We walked back across the grass to Uncle Burl's house, and the second the door was closed behind us, I grabbed Lainey's arm and told her. I told her everything. The rack closest to the door, the infant onesies, the sizes going back through the decades, the perfect cleanliness of them. Lainey stared at me with her mouth slightly open, and she asked me if I was sure. I was sure. We didn't know what to do. We thought about calling someone, but we didn't know what we would say. An elderly woman had a collection of old children's clothes in a spare bedroom. That wasn't a crime. It wasn't even necessarily strange, depending on who she was. But I couldn't let it go. And the next morning I drove into town and I went to the little one-room public library that sat across from the post office. And I asked the librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Pickett who had worked there, she told me, for 31 years, if she could tell me anything about Miss Junie Crocker. Mrs. Pickett went very quiet. She looked at me for a long moment over her reading glasses. Then she glanced at the door of the library, as if to make sure nobody else was coming in, and she got up and led me back into a small back office and closed the door. She sat down across from me at a metal desk, and she folded her hands in front of her, and she told me, in a voice just above a whisper, that Miss Junie had been the unofficial midwife for the Hollow and the surrounding country for almost 40 years, from the early 60s until she finally got too arthritic to do it anymore in the late 90s. She had delivered, Mrs. Pickett said, more babies in this part of the county than any doctor. Families had trusted her. Poor families, mostly. The ones who couldn't afford the drive to the hospital or didn't want to go. She went out at all hours. She came when she was called. And, Mrs. Pickett said, her voice getting quieter, a number of those deliveries, going back to the 60s, had been recorded as stillbirths. More than people thought was usual. More than the doctor in the next county over had thought was usual. But nobody had ever done anything about it. Because the families had trusted her. Because she was a sweet old woman who had spent her whole life helping. Because nobody wanted to be the one to say it. Because the babies had already been buried in little plots behind little churches, and nobody wanted to dig them up. I asked Mrs. Pickett if she believed they had really been stillbirths. She looked at me for a long time. Then she looked down at her hands. She said, very softly, I don't know what I believe. I know she was a kind woman. I know she was at every funeral. I know a lot of those mamas and daddies went to their graves thanking her for being there. I don't know what I believe. I didn't go back to Miss Junie's house after that. Lainey and I finished the work on Uncle Burl's place 3 weeks later, and we listed it, and we drove back to Nashville. Miss Junie came over to say goodbye on our last morning. She brought us a jar of homemade strawberry preserves. She hugged Lainey. She hugged me. She told us to take care of ourselves and to come visit her if we were ever back in the Hollow. Her hands were small and warm when she held mine. Her eyes crinkled when she smiled. I smiled back at her. I thanked her for the preserves. I let go of her hand as gently as I could. Miss Junie is dead now. She passed about 6 years after we left, in her sleep, at the age of 87, according to an obituary Lainey found online one night when we were looking her up. A niece from Memphis inherited the little yellow house and sold it within the year. I have thought many times about writing to that niece, about telling her what I saw. I have never done it. I don't know what I would say. I don't know what good it would do. The clothes may have been cleaned out by now. The house may have been painted. The racks may have been hauled to the dump. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that room, about the rack closest to the door with the tiny yellowed onesies, about how each outfit was pressed and straightened, about how there were no photographs, no toys, no names, just the clothes, sized and organized and kept. And I find myself thinking about how many mamas in that hollow might have walked past that little yellow house over the years, carrying groceries home from the store, waving at sweet old Miss Junie on her porch, never knowing that the dress their baby would have worn to its first Easter was hanging, perfectly preserved, behind one of her closed doors. I rented the upstairs of a split house in a hill town in southwestern Pennsylvania, the fall. I took a teaching job at a small community college about 20 miles away. The town itself was one of those places at the very edge of Appalachian country, where the hills start to rise and the farms get smaller and the towns get quieter, and it had maybe 2,000 people in it, a single main street with a diner and a pharmacy and a hardware store, and a patchwork of old residential streets climbing the hill behind it. The house I rented was on one of those back streets, a two-story wood frame place painted a faded dark green, set on a narrow lot with a crooked maple tree out front. The landlord had divided it into 2 units some years before. The downstairs was a full one-bedroom apartment with its own entrance around the side. The upstairs, which I rented, had its own separate entrance at the back of the house, up a set of wooden outdoor stairs. The 2 tenants shared only a small front porch at ground level, where the original front door led into a tiny shared foyer with our 2 mailboxes. The downstairs tenant was an older man named Dale. I met him the day I moved in. He was, I would guess, somewhere in his late 60s, heavyset, with a gray beard and thin gray hair combed back from a wide forehead, and he always wore the same uniform of a plaid flannel shirt and dark work pants regardless of the weather. He was retired, he told me, when I introduced myself, from a job at the steel plant that had closed down 20 years before, and he lived on a small disability check and a smaller pension. He was polite. He shook my hand firmly. He welcomed me to the house. And from that first afternoon, almost every time I came or went, Dale was sitting on the front porch in a white plastic chair, smoking a cigarette, watching the street. He would nod at me when I passed. Sometimes he would raise a hand. We exchanged pleasantries about the weather a few times in the first weeks, but mostly we kept to ourselves, the way tenants in a shared house often do. For the first month I lived in that apartment, nothing was strange. I liked the place. The upstairs had 3 small rooms, and a tiny kitchen and a bathroom with a slanted ceiling you had to duck under to get to the toilet, and it was cheap, and the windows looked out over the maple tree and down the hill toward the town. I slept well there, better than I had in a long time, actually. My apartment in the city before had always felt noisy, and here, in the hills, the nights were so quiet that I sometimes woke up in the small hours and lay listening to the wind in the maple and thinking that I had made a good decision moving here. The dream started during the 2nd week. I don't mean that I'd never had dreams before. Everyone dreams. But these dreams were different in a way that was hard to describe. They were vivid in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood, and they did not feel like my own. They had settings I had never seen, populated by people I had never met, carrying emotions that did not belong to me. In the first one, I was walking through a wheat field at dusk, barefoot, holding the hand of a little boy I had never seen in my life but who I loved, with a grief so deep I woke up crying. In another, I was standing in the kitchen of a farmhouse I had never been in, watching a storm come over a ridge, knowing that something bad was going to happen when it arrived. I would wake from these dreams and lie in the dark and feel, for long minutes, that I was not myself, that I was still halfway in the other person's life. They would fade eventually, and I would go back to sleep, and in the morning I would remember them clearly, but they would feel distant, the way a movie feels distant, like something that had happened to someone else. About a month into my tenancy, I had the dream about the barn. I dreamed of a specific red barn, the paint flaking off in long strips, sitting in a clearing ringed by tall pines. The barn was collapsing in on itself. The roof had caved in at the center, and one of the walls was bowed outward as if something had pushed against it from the inside. In the dream, I stood at the edge of the clearing looking at the barn, and I knew, with the certainty of dream knowledge, that something was moving in the hayloft. I could not see it, I could only hear it, a slow, heavy shifting sound, like a large animal settling its weight from one foot to the other. And I knew that if I stood there long enough, whatever was up there would come to the window of the hayloft and look down at me. And I knew that I must not let that happen. In the dream, I turned and ran back through the pines. And I woke up just as the shifting sound started to get closer to the window, and I lay in my bed in the dark with my heart pounding for a long time before I was able to go back to sleep. The next morning, I left for work at my usual time. I was walking down the outdoor staircase at the back of the house, carrying my coffee thermos and my bag, and as I came around the side of the building, Dale was standing at the bottom of the stairs. He was not smoking. He was just standing there, looking up at me, waiting. When I reached him, he didn't move out of my way. He said quietly, "That dream you had last night about the barn, that ain't yours. Don't go looking for it." I stopped on the last step. I remember my hand tightening on the railing. I remember the cold of the metal on my palm. I tried to make sense of what he had just said. I tried to decide if I had heard him right. Dale was looking at me with an expression that was not frightening. It was not menacing. It was, if I had to put a word to it, sorry, like a man who was about to deliver bad news to a friend. He said, "I know how that sounds. I know you're going to tell yourself I said something else. I didn't. Just don't go looking for that barn, okay?" I laughed. It came out nervous and thin. I said something like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And I stepped around him, and I walked to my car as fast as I could without running. My hand was shaking when I put the key in the ignition. I sat there in the driveway for a full minute before I trusted myself to drive. And my whole way to the college, I kept trying to come up with a rational explanation. I had talked in my sleep. I had mentioned the dream to someone and forgotten. Dale had read it on my face somehow. I had written it down and left the notebook out. None of the explanations fit. I hadn't told a single person about the dream. I hadn't written it down. I had woken up, lain in bed, and eventually gone back to sleep. That was the entire history of the dream as far as anyone but me was concerned. For the next several days, I stayed away from Dale. I took my mail quickly. I came and went by the back stairs. I didn't make eye contact with him when I saw him on the front porch. I told myself that whatever had happened, it was a coincidence, an unlikely one, and if I just ignored it, it would go away. 4 nights later, I had a dream about a woman in a blue dress. In the dream, I was asleep in my own bed, in the upstairs apartment, and I woke up still in the dream to find a woman in a long blue dress standing at the foot of my bed. She was middle-aged, with dark hair pinned up, and she was not looking at me. She was looking at something on the wall behind my headboard, as if she was reading something written there. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her expression was one of mild, patient sadness. I lay there in the dream paralyzed, unable to move or speak, and after what felt like a long time, she turned her head slowly and looked directly at me, and her mouth opened a little as if she was about to say something, and I woke up with a gasp, sweating, my heart hammering in my chest. The next morning, Dale was at the bottom of the stairs again. He looked at me as I came down. He said quietly, "The woman in the blue dress, she wasn't looking at you, she was reading something. Don't try to figure out what it said." I stopped. I set my bag down on the stairs. I said, "Dale, how are you doing this?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he gestured toward his plastic chair on the porch and he said, "Sit with me a minute." I sat. My whole body felt like it was humming. He lit a cigarette and he stared out at the street for a while before he spoke. Then he told me, in that slow, careful way older men in the hills tell things, that he wasn't doing anything. He had lived in the downstairs of that house for 22 years. He had not always been able to do this. It had started, he said, about 6 months after he moved in. He would hear a new tenant's dream in his head, the way you hear a song in your head, and he would know whose dream it was. He had tried for a long time, when he was younger, to understand what was happening. Eventually, he had asked his grandmother about it on a trip back to the family place in West Virginia, and his grandmother, who was in her 90s by then, had told him that the piece of land that house was built on had been what she called thin ground. She told him that some land in these mountains was thin, and that people who slept on thin ground sometimes caught dreams that didn't belong to them. The dreams of the people who had lived there before. The dreams of people who had lived there a long time ago. Sometimes the dreams of people who had never lived there at all, but had only passed through and left something behind. And she told him that the real danger of thin ground was not the dreaming. The real danger was that if you liked the dreams too much, or if you went looking for them in your waking life, the things in the dreams could notice you. And once a thing from a dream noticed you, his grandmother said, it could follow you. It could follow you out of the house. It could follow you into other houses. It could follow you for the rest of your life. Dale told me all this with the weariness of a man who had told it many times before. He said 4 other tenants had rented the upstairs apartment during his years in the house, and he had tried, with each of them, to warn them gently. Most had thought he was crazy. Most had moved out within a few months. One, a young woman in the 90s, had stayed for 2 years and had gone looking, Dale said, had driven out into the countryside trying to find the places in her dreams. She had found one of them, a bridge over a creek, and Dale said she had changed after that, gotten quiet, stopped leaving the apartment, and eventually moved out in the middle of the night without giving notice. He said he didn't know what had happened to her. He said he hoped she was all right. I asked him what I should do. He said the same thing he had said at the bottom of the stairs. Don't go looking. Don't try to figure out what the woman was reading. Don't drive out into the country looking for a red barn. Treat the dreams like a radio station you had accidentally tuned into and leave alone. He said the best thing I could do was move. He said he was sorry. He said he should have told me sooner, but he had hoped I would be one of the ones who didn't dream. I broke my lease 2 weeks later. The landlord tried to keep my security deposit. I told him to keep it. I moved into a cheap apartment above the pharmacy in town until the spring semester ended, and then I took a job at a different college in a different state. I never went back to that house. I never saw Dale again. I tried calling him once, a year later, from my new place, using a number I had kept for him. The number had been disconnected. I didn't have the heart to call the landlord to ask about him. The dreams did not stop when I moved. They got less frequent over the years, but they never entirely went away. I still dream, sometimes, of a red barn collapsing in on itself. I still dream, sometimes, of a woman in a blue dress standing at the foot of my bed. I have never gone looking for any of it. I have never tried to find out what she was reading. But sometimes, when I wake up from one of those dreams in the small hours of the morning, I lie in the dark and I think of Dale on his porch, in his plastic chair, and I think about how kind it was of him to meet me at the bottom of the stairs those mornings, and to tell me what he told me, even when I didn't want to hear it. And I find myself wishing, in the quiet of those hours, that I still had someone who could tell me whether the dream I had just had was really mine, or whether it belonged to someone else, someone long gone, who was just passing through me on their way to somewhere I would never see.